following podcast is brought to you by GoodPoliticsRadio.com.
And now, from Washington, the Inside Scoop. All the news the government does not want you to hear. Now, here's your host on the Inside Scoop, Mark Levine.
Good afternoon, America. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. Today is a very special edition of news the government does not want you to hear. Surely the government does not want you to know that the United States ambassador to Italy under George W. Bush and ambassador to Australia under George Bush Sr. is a man who ran a number of what he called teenage drug rehabilitation facilities, and which its inmates call torture camps, concentration camps, abuse. It's really an extraordinary story, particularly since this man and his conduct, that, by the way, of him and his wife, Betty Sembler, was well known to officials, both in our government and in Congress, at the time he was appointed ambassador by George W. Bush and approved by the Senate. It sounds too incredible to be true. Here's a man who should be in jail for life, from what I understand happened at these facilities, and I guarantee you, in the next 2 hours, you will be hearing from survivor after survivor. There are some 12,000 teenage American kids that went through these facilities, and they're just starting to speak out. In fact, many of them have been speaking out for some time, but have not been heard. This is the first time, in fact, that Mel and Betty Sembler's facilities, called straightinc, are being talked about on radio. And the scandal is widespread. It is scandalous that this happened. It is scandalous that this continues to happen. And it is perhaps even more scandalous that a man who caused these horrible things to happen would be appointed ambassador to Italy. In fact, your taxpayer money is also going to building a building in Rome in Mel Sembler's honor. So who is Mel Sembler? What did he do? And why am I so incensed about this? Well, let me tell you something. I did a show, the first show that I'm aware ever on radio on this subject, last Thursday. And I have to admit, it sounded too horrible to be true, but I trusted the reporter John Gorenfeld, who came and reported on this, and I looked into some of the things he had, and everything checked out. And so I did the show on Thursday, and the calls, and the emails, and the comments on the blog came in, one right after the other. As we are now, the lines are already full, folks, and I haven't even started the show. I haven't even given out the phone number yet, which is 877-528-TALK, but you can't call in at this moment because the lines are full. And they're full with survivors, kids, American kids, who were put in these facilities almost always against their own will. Many of them didn't even have drug problems, but were put in these facilities, tried to be scared straight, but instead they were abused, tortured, beaten. Frankly, I don't know that I can discuss all of the allegations in the next 2 hours, but I'm going to give it a try. Let me start by reading some comments on my blog, and then I've got 3 survivors online, and then I'll introduce you to the reporter who did so much yeoman's work in helping to break this story, John Gorenfeld. First, let's go right to the comments from the survivors. This is Mark, who writes in on the blog. You can follow along. By the way, some of these are from last Thursday's blog. He writes, I was a victim of Mel Sembler's teen torture camp, straightinc, in St. Petersburg, Florida during the early 1980s. I was routinely abused, denied food, water, sleep, and use of bathroom facilities. I was subjected to physical, mental, and emotional abuse, often directed by executive staff members, as well as peer staff members who were graduates of the program. Mel Sembler knew of and approved of the use of these methods. He's a criminal who's profited from the pain and abuse of thousands of children and has participated in defrauding parents of millions of dollars. Friends, this is not your ordinary Bush crony. This is not Mike Brown, who only was completely incompetent as New Orleans was deluged. This is a man who, from every indication I've seen, needs to be in jail for a long time, and yet Bush has appointed him as ambassador to Italy. One of the things Mark points out is something we heard a lot on Thursday, the peer staff. They were teens torturing teens. Teens told they had to torture other teens or they themselves would get in trouble. Frankly, it's a lot like that famous book, William Golding's Lord of the Flies, where kids ran their own torture society. One more comment, and then I've got to go to the lines. They're full up with people who want to talk on this. This is a comment from someone who writes anonymously. Anon writes, I'm glad this story is finally getting the recognition it deserves. Mel Sembler and everything he stands for needs to be finally brought out into the light. I am another survivor of straight who is haunted by nightmares to this day of what happened there. I witnessed others tortured in there along with my own torment. I was starved, denied sleep, over-exercised, experienced in-your-face drilling, no release date ever revealed. He compares the situation to Abu Ghraib or Al-Qaeda and says, thank you, Mark Levine, for caring enough to air this long but thankfully not forgotten chapter of this ever-growing warped Republican scandal. Thank you again to John Gorenfeld for stepping up to the plate and getting the truth out. One more comment from the blog. This is from Samantha Monroe. She writes, I was a victim of Straight Inc. in Sarasota, Florida. I wish I could call in tonight, but I have to work. If I could have called in, I would have said these abuses have not stopped. There is no regulation of these types of maltreatment centers. The directors need only grease the palms of the Republicans, and they are protected. She goes on to say that Oprah did a story on Straight in the 80s, and there's numbers jumped, and she holds the state of Florida responsible for a torture camp that she calls an American gulag. Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I know it sounds too incredible to be true. I myself couldn't believe the scope of this thing until I did a show last Thursday and people called and they wrote, already we have Holding Ray from Tampa, Chris from Ohio, and William from Midland, Virginia, survivors of Straight Inc. And it is hard to believe that this man who conducted what seems to be a series of torture camps, prison camps, claiming to be drug rehab centers, could grease a few palms of the Bush campaign and be appointed as ambassador to Australia or Italy, but it is true. And the person who's probably done the most, no, I don't want to say done the most, because there have been so many people, but the person who's done a lot of good work exposing this is John Gorenfeld, reporter out in California. John, welcome back to the Inside Scoop.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming back. Tell me something. In the last few days, this story's gotten a lot of press all over, the internet, my show. Have you heard from a lot of people on this?
Yeah, well, it's just starting to get going. We got started on Thursday, and I think we were both completely floored by some of the stories that we heard from people calling in.
Sure.
You talked about Lord of the Flies. At least the humiliation and horror of Lord of the Flies was free. This is something where they charge parents $12,000 a year for something that included rape rooms, things you couldn't do to your kid in your own basement.
I mean, after all, we invaded Iraq for torture, at least we claim to, but it sounds like it was happening under our own nose by an official that was later ambassador from the United States. I want to talk to you a lot, John. We have 2 hours. A lot of people, though, are already trying to call in. The lines are already full. Let me stop talking and get right to one of the victims of Straight Inc., Ray from Tampa. Ray, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
Hi, Mark. How are you guys? Hey, John.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. My name is Richard Bradbury. I'm from Tampa, Florida. I am a former Straight client. I'm a former Straight staff member, or paid staff member of Straight. And I've been involved with this for, this year makes 20 years as an activist, and I was in Straight from 1983 through 1985. When I resigned my staff position there. For the viewers that are tuning in tonight, I know you have a much larger audience than you did on Thursday night tonight. Straight, just to give you some background on it, was a national level organization that had centers across the country, had approximately 12. And this was an organization that was endorsed, supported, operated, with the blessing of the Republican Party. And with the President of the United States involved with this.
Now, Ray, give us specifics, because I got to tell you, we have listeners of all political stripes to listen to the show. A lot of them are going to say, well, this is Mark Levine, and he used to work for the Democrats, and so give us specifics of how the Republicans were involved in Straight.
Well, the founder of Straight, Melvin Sembler, he's a Republican. He's donated a lot of money to the Republican Party, and not only has he donated it, he's raised a lot of money. He was the chairman of the Republican National Finance Committee. He's been appointed ambassador by the first President Bush to Australia back in the early 90s, and then he was appointed ambassador to Italy. I mean, the Republicans, when you walked in the Strait, I'll speed it up so everybody gets a chance. When you would walk into the door at Strait, on the wall, Nancy Reagan had visited Strait. Her picture's on the wall at every Strait facility. You walk in, there's Princess Diana. They got her to visit Strait. And, you walk in the wall, and there's George Bush's picture, senior, on the wall. I mean, it was a Republican-sponsored thing. It was back. And just so you know, so your listeners know, I'm not registered as a Democrat or Republican. In fact, this could be another show, but I've never voted. I've been an activist for the last 20 years, and the thing is to educate people about what happened to these kids. For example, John Gornfield was talking in his report about a boy named Bradley Martin, who was spat on and called a faggot, and who it's a death row case out of Pennsylvania. This young man was in Strait between about 1988 and about 1990. Prior to being in Strait, and you got to have a little bit of history on this young man to understand this case and appreciate it. He had been molested by a relative, a very close family member who ended up going to prison. Well, Bradley started to exhibit problems after being molested by this family, a very close family member. So the parents put him in Strait. They had no idea what the problem was. Well, part of Strait is confessing and breaking down these kids, and I'll explain that as quickly as I can. But Bradley stood up during one of these confessionals and confessed that this relative molested him. Well, the very first thing they did to Bradley is they called him a fag and a faggot. He talked about
this child had been molested.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
The people who ran the program called him a fag.
Yes, in fact, the very same experience happened to me is being called a fag, and it happened to. You've got callers online. We could be on here all night long having people come on and talk about this is the MO, the mode of operation for this place. Right in front of me now, I have the court opinion by Judge Robert Abay from Levin County, Pennsylvania, where it talks about, see what happened was after Strait, Bradley went out, Bradley turned 18, and he was able to leave Strait. That's how he got out. He escaped a few times, but every time he came back. And he was brought back, shall I say. And Bradley at age 18 signed himself out, got out of Strait, and he committed a very, very heinous crime after Strait. He murdered a gay lover, an older man who was in his 60s or 70s, and Bradley ended up being placed on death row for this crime. Well, there was some appeal. And by the way, Tom Ridge, who was the governor of Pennsylvania, Republican, signed a death warrant for Bradley Martin around August of 2000, if my recollection serves me correctly. So here's this Republican, Melvin Sembler, that runs Strait. Here's these Republicans supporting Strait, the President of the United States. And here's a Republican now signing this young man's death warrant.
Richard, I want to break it down because you go. I know you know these facts very well, and you've mentioned a lot of them. Let's just break it down here. So you have this kid who was in Strait against his will because he, of course, not his fault, was molested by a relative. He goes into Strait. He's spat on. He's called a faggot. Now, of course, no one likes to be spit on or called names, but I've used the word torture. So many people have here. I assume what goes on in Strait is worse than being spat on and called names. Is that fair, Richard?
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
Give me some examples of some of the...
I can read a part of the court ruling, which is public record. This is the judge's opinion on why Mr. Martin should have a new sentencing phase. Right now he has no sentence. His death sentence was overturned, and they're going to have a new entire hearing, a trial on a new sentencing phase for this young man.
Briefly read from what happened to Bradley.
On page 56 of the judge's opinion, while at a host home, the upper phase patients, not the host parents, were in charge of the household, and the lower phase patients, the first phase patients, had to ask permission to eat and utilize the bathroom. And if the upper phase patients refused, then the first phase patients did not eat or utilize the bathroom. In the section that deals with Bradley Martin being called a fag, when defendant refused to speak, and this is on page 55.
Okay, go ahead. To confess.
When defendant refused to speak to other patients, one of the things you talked about the other night was misbehavior. Well, what that is, let me tell you what a misbehavior is in Strait. It's a child, minor children, some are adults, but most of them are minors, 85% approximately, that does not want to sit up straight in their chair or to motivate to get called on clap their arms. You're a misbehavior. And what happens is you are called a misbehavior because it's a label. It's a code word. You are targeted for more severe abuse than the others.
Give me examples of the abuse.
Pardon me?
Give me examples of the abuse. Not being allowed to eat.
There was somebody used the word Jason, a caller the other night, used the word restraint. Well, restraint is really not restraint. It's just a code name. What restraint is where other patients, other clients, grab you, take you, they sit you on the floor, they sit on you. I mean, we're talking about one kid on one arm, one on another, one on each leg, one on your stomach. They'll spit at you, they'll yell at you, they'll take you into a timeout room, they'll take you on a war party, they'll slam your head against the wall. It doesn't matter. Kids have been knocked unconscious and had to go to the hospital. this is not a case of a rogue staff member that's gone crazy that did this to these kids. This is institutionalized and systematic child abuse, and that every child that went in there was abused. And you're saying, no, Rich, that is not possible.
And you saw it with your own eyes, Richard. Okay,
absolutely.
I'll tell you, there's so many people that have seen this. I want to get to them as well. Richard, thank you for this. One last thing I know you were going to point out, I'll just point it out briefly, is that this child who was molested and then abused and tortured at Straight Inc. then went out and killed a gay man, and in fact the judge found that because he himself, the killer, Bradley, was tortured at Straight Inc., that's an extenuating circumstance in his own murder. Later on. It's an incredible story. We do have a lot of callers on the line, though, and we have to go to a break, unfortunately. We'll be right back with more of the Inside Scoop. The Inside Scoop, and what an Inside Scoop we have, a network of torture camps, of prison camps for teens. They were called drug rehab centers. Their founder was Melvin Sembler and his wife Betty Sembler. They were investigated, in fact, shut down, but you give enough money to the Republican Party and you can buy respectability. My guest is John Gorenfeld, and also all the many people who were persecuted, and I think that's a fair word, in the Straight Inc. torture camps. John, how is it that Mel Sembler, how is it that his camps were shut down, and then how did he buy respectability afterwards?
Well, what we're looking at is this massive wave of lawsuits, the law cracking down on these places. These are places thousands of miles away from each other that we just heard a description of some of the abuses at one place that led to a guy possibly committing a murder. Identical abuses all over the country, 9 states, 12 clinics. One by one, they all went dark because the law caught up with them. Victims sued for huge six-figure settlements, and by 1993, they had winked out of business, although they continue today in spin-off companies.
They still continue today?
Yeah, there are a number of people who were true believers in this system that was declared illegal, that is still flourishing in places like Jeb Bush's Florida. For example, a place called Safe, if I could just talk about that for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
If you go to my website, there's an amazing link to an amazing video from WAMI-TV in Florida from 2000. This is like something from a David Lynch movie. There's a clinic called Safe. This girl goes to visit her sister, who's in there for heroin addiction. This girl is completely drug-free. She goes in and is told that the whole family has to sign up. She's dragged into the back by a pack of girls and forced to submit to the strip search. And who should show up to defend all of this? And there's also some amazingly frightening footage of these people these kids forced to flap their arms in order to get the right to talk.
They have to flap their arms in order to get the right to talk.
You just see this blur of kids flapping their arms, and they're furiously, and if they're not doing that, that's considered not being motivated enough to be healing. And this goes on for hours, all day. Okay,
but now back up here now, because we have to go to a break very shortly.
Yeah.
These were all shut down. At least Straight Inc. was shut down by '93. And yet they're starting up again. Is it still Mel and Betty Sembler behind this? Who's behind this?
They definitely distanced themselves from it, although they're former employees. Instead of being in prison, as you might expect from this huge wave of lawlessness, instead they're former marketing directors and other officials are now running companies with different names and in the same locations many times that just sprung up instantly to replace the ones that ran into trouble with the law, places like Safe, Kids Helping Kids. And then there's some real charlatans out there empowered by these Republicans, like a guy who now calls himself a priest, Dr. Miller Newton of Florida, who's had to pay out $12 million for a whole range of abuse.
John, we've got to take another break again. I'm sorry. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. You know, of course, of Abu Ghraib. You know of Saddam Hussein's rape rooms and torture chambers. You hear of tortures that we do to Al-Qaeda prisoners. Some may be innocent, some may be guilty. But did you know that in the 80s and 90s, and apparently still today, American teens are being tortured, spat upon, sat on, denied food? One woman apparently was forced to defecate in her own trousers, something they called humble pants, by an organization called Straight Inc., whose founder, Mel Sembler, was rewarded by George W. Bush as ambassador to Italy. I've had so many calls on the line. Frankly, they've been busy the entire time. Plus, we've got at least a couple dozen emails here. Let me read you another comment from the blog. This is from Patty. Patty writes, "Thank you. I also endured the many abuses Straight Inc. called treatment. I am forever damaged. I was tortured physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I was violently restrained by untrained staff and other clients. I was refused 1 second of privacy. I was refused an attorney when I asked to leave. I was refused communication of any kind to my parents or anyone outside the building. I was refused medical treatment, which has left me with major long-term effects. They tortured us in so many unthinkable ways. These people experimented on us without informed consent from us. They used thought reform techniques, which closely resemble techniques used on war prisoners. Many started to believe we somehow deserved this treatment. Many did not wake up and start remembering until 15 years later. This memory repression was part of the Sembler plan. We've gone unheard of for far too long." And she goes on to say, "Thank you for having the courage to bring the Mel Sembler story into public view. Some of these programs are still open today under different names. Some have adopted the techniques Straight used and are torturing children to this very day." And we've got caller after caller who's a survivor of these programs, along with my guest, John Garnfeld, who is a reporter who helped break this story. And coming up soon, we have another guest, Dr. Arnold Trebach, who happened to play a major role in shutting these things down and is horrified to see they're still continuing. But first, I want to hear from another survivor. This is Chris from Ohio. Chris, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Chris, you're also a survivor of Straight?
Yes, I was in the Cincinnati branch from late October of 84 to early February of 86.
Tell me what happened.
And, I was one that was accused of having a drug problem that never did. I had never touched a drug in my life, and of course I was called a liar, and I was supposedly in denial. Of course, I was subjected to a lot of confrontation when I was initially brought in because I was in denial, and that has scarred me for life.
Well, now, your parents sent you there?
Yes,
they were
there.
I mean, were they tricked by officials saying they would heal you? Why did they send you there?
Yeah, they told my parents that I had all the symptoms of a druggie, that even if I wasn't using drugs, I would be soon, and classified me as a possible dry druggie, but then also told them that I might be lying as well. So, and they also scared the living daylights out of my parents, saying I'd end up dead or in jail. And, my parents were afraid because they knew there were problems going on with me that were mostly due to depression and, my parents' divorce, stuff like that. And, they fell for it. They were very, very vulnerable parents.
And how long were you there?
It was a grand total of 15 and a half months, and then I was 4.5 to 5 months into the aftercare, and then I was kidnapped.
You were kidnapped?
Yes. I had turned 18, and I was, like I said, in the aftercare, and I broke one of the rules that was no dating for 6 months, and I got caught for it. And Straight, again, scared the living daylights out of my parents and talked my parents into getting 3 accomplices to kidnap me and take me back to Straight against my will, and I was 18 years old.
Chris, I'm so sorry to hear that. It sounds like worse than a cult. Tell me, what were some of the abuses you saw with your own eyes there at Straight Inc.?
The restraint. I saw that all the time, and that's one thing that scared me to death, and it scared me into compliance eventually. Kids, they let kids carve in their arms all day long and did nothing about it.
Kids carving into their arms with a knife?
Yes, with their own fingernails.
With their own fingernails. They were so depressed and upset by what was going on there?
Yes, and they would also be confronted and humiliated for these things instead of getting help. They were ridiculed for it and treated like misbehaviors. We were also watched in the bathrooms. Our most private moments were on display.
You were watched in the bathroom?
Yes.
When you were on the toilet, people were watching you?
Yes, we had to keep the stalls open, and the old comers would watch the newcomers. And then when you graduated when you got off first base, then it was your job to watch the newcomers, and then they'd watch us in the showers.
Did they tell you why they were doing all of this to you?
No, never. It was just part of the daily routine, It was something we had to do, and we had absolutely no choice whatsoever, or else, we saw the consequences of refusing to comply, being restrained or being humiliated and yelled at in the group by your peers, you know.
Chris, I want to thank you so much for calling. I could talk with you a lot longer, but I'm afraid there are other victims of Straight Inc. that have called in and want to be heard as well. But thank you very much for calling into the Inside Scoop.
Thank you so much.
And let me read to you from yet another survivor of Straight Inc. This is Shanna. Shanna writes, Shanna writes, I was in Richardson, Texas in 1987. I was 13 years old. I got up to third phase, copped out, got brought back, and misbehaved. I was abused, the same as everyone else there. I would bang my own head on the floor for relief. When I left to go to a psycho ward, they counted 52 scabs on my arms for what I dug into myself with my own fingernails. I was not allowed to go to school. Many of us tried to escape what Straight has turned us into with suicide. I have a scar on my wrist that shows the everyday pain of having to live with myself. Today I keep my windows covered, my doors locked. I live in fear. Thank you for giving us a voice. There are still children in these places being abused like I was. They're not allowed to use a computer, phone, or even mail a letter to voice what is happening to them. Many of these kids don't even know they're being abused. They think it's normal. The survivors of Straight are the voices for the children that cannot speak. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Shanna, for telling us what's going on here. These so-called drug rehab centers, and I have to tell you, I support the concept of drug rehabilitation. Of course I do. I think they're far better than prisons. And yet what do we have here? We have something that should be for a good end to help people get off the addictive scourge of drugs, and it's being used almost like a prison camp. And a real expert on all this, long before even John Garnfeld got involved, is Dr. Arnold Trebek. He is a professor emeritus at American University. In fact, he's a former head of a civil rights division of the Justice Department back in the 1960s during the height of the civil rights era. But for the last 20 years, he's been focusing on shutting down Straight. In fact, he was influential in shutting it down in the 1990s, but knows all too well that these kinds of abuses are still continuing today. Dr. Trebek, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
Thank you.
The stories that you've heard here on the radio, do any of these surprise you?
No, I'll tell you what surprises me. I thought by this time, 20 years on, the country, this wonderful country, would have said enough, we've had enough, and we've got to stop this. But what is remarkable is, I feel, to an extent I've been successful, but mainly I feel I've been a failure because I know of no case where a major medical organization has taken on this issue and said it's got to stop. I know of no case, and there must have been one, where the FBI received a complaint and said we're going to investigate these obvious violations of the kidnapping statute, violations of the civil rights laws, and we have had no congressional hearings on these things. Even though I've campaigned for such things to occur, they've not occurred. Now, we don't even have a law, which I proposed a long time ago, which would say that no person can be kept in a facility without the right. I mean, no youth. Let's talk about children. No person under 18 can be kept in the facility outside of the criminal law where that youth cannot every day make a phone call to an outside advocate, to parents, to a lawyer, what have you. In other words, we have children being kept in facilities where they would have more rights to outside intervention if they were in jail. Yeah. So all of this continues, which is an amazement to me.
Dr. Trebek, who is protecting these people? Why aren't they being prosecuted?
I don't know. I've spent a lot of time talking to people on the other side, and I think the problem is that there is a belief, and this is the tough part of this, there's a belief on the part of many responsible people in this society that drugs are so dangerous that it is acceptable medical treatment to virtually destroy children who use them or who are suspected of using them. So I don't think we're against some kind of evil, money-grubbing conspiracy. We're against something much tougher. The belief in the minds of millions of decent people that this is the proper way to treat children who are suspected of using drugs.
I mean, just to be clear on my own views on this matter, I firmly believe that treatment centers usually, not in this case, but usually are better than lockup. I think jail is not only more expensive, but when I think of nonviolent drug users, frankly, I think of people with a problem who need help, like a mental health disorder, not like criminals, again, nonviolent drug users, who need to be locked up. And I think treatment centers, and maybe even lockup treatment centers, may be the way to go. But then I hear what's gone on here, and frankly, it scares me of any of these kinds of things. Dr. Trebach, what can the state do, or the federal government, either one, to regulate these drug rehab centers to make sure that they treat people properly?
I support treatment.
Okay.
There are many good treatment facilities out there, many good treatment people. And I personally have taken at least 3 people to locked psychiatric facilities because they were really, they were hurting themselves with drugs. Right. I've done that.
Okay.
So I accept all of the good stuff. Okay. What I'm saying is that I think that what has got to occur is there must be national leadership to see to it, for example, that local FBI officers, and there are about 58 of them, I guess, around the country, go into these places and investigate kidnappings, investigate abuse, investigate false imprisonment. All of them a violation of federal law. In addition, there ought to be a congressional investigation to lay out what has to be done here. And it's very clear what has to be done. It must be made clear in federal law that no person can be held without the right to contact someone on the outside.
John Gornfeld, is there any evidence that because Mel Sembler and Betty Sembler gave so much money to the Republican Party, so much, in fact, they were appointed ambassador to Italy, that all this money is part of the reason for the cover-up of their criminal activity?
Yes, there is actually. And, as we know, the Semblers and other people involved in Straight gave so much money to the Republican Party, with George W. Bush thanking the ambassador in 2000 for setting a new record, raising $21 million at one dinner for wealthy contributors.
$21 million?
At a single dinner.
At one dinner, Mel Sembler helped raise for Bush.
He was a real he's a real go-getter. He's one of the best, hardest-working Republican money raisers out there.
Sounds like a good reason for the FBI not to investigate.
Yeah, and we know from an investigation, earlier this hour we had Richard Bradbury who called up, this whistleblower.
Right.
He actually triggered this investigation by a health department inspector general in Florida who discovered that the Florida branch of this facility would have been shut down probably in 1989, except that Republican politicians made phone calls warning the inspectors that who are at the site, who are discovering signs of children who are restrained and stomped upon and sent to the hospital with injuries. They found out that these people were told, "Look, no matter what you find, we're gonna renew the license." This guy is this is run by somebody who's about to become ambassador to Australia, and so because of this, and the St. Petersburg Times called it a persistent foul odor lingering over this whole thing. Because of this, for 4 more years, teenagers continued to be tortured, essentially, at this place that otherwise, if not for political influence of Republicans, would probably have been shut down in disgrace in 1989.
And now I understand that we're spending $30 million, American taxpayers, on the Mel Sembler building in Rome, a palace?
Yeah, actually, there's this 1927 palace.
It's going to honor this torturer?
Yeah, Representative C.W. Bill Young from
tell you what, we got to take another break, but I want to hear more about this palace. After the break, welcome back to the Inside Scoop on the blog. Jane writes, "Thank you for doing this story. I was in Straight Dallas in 1989 for 5 months. I'd smoked pot one time a year before. I was screamed at constantly, told that I was lying about everything, that I was a drug addict. I lived in fear of being stood up and confronted for God only knew what, whatever they decided to make up that day. I didn't understand what was happening, and I was too young to consider that the people running that place were crazy. I eventually came to believe that I was a drug addict. I grew to be in constant fear of being fake, prideful, of thinking of running away, which was also against the rules, of singing any songs in my head, of looking the wrong way. I learned how to lock up all my wrong thoughts into a little box and keep them there. That place was deplorable, and how it could stay open and have spin-offs in operation even today is something I just can't even fathom. Hanging on the line is William from Midland, Virginia, also a survivor of Straight Inc. William, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
Hello.
Hello, you're on the air, William.
Yes.
Tell us what you saw there.
Well, pretty much it was a lot of motivating, where we had to flap our arms and we weren't allowed to come out of our chair, but
what was that about, William?
To get called on, even though the staff would have the list of people they were going to call on already. So, I mean, it was like a scam.
William, what was the flapping of arms about? That seems to be a theme. Everyone seems to have had to flap their arms. What was that about?
Yeah, the harder you flap them, the more chances there are that you'll get called on.
Called on?
Yeah, like your name would be called by the staff member that was sitting in the chair up front. You know,
and if your name is called on, then what?
Well, then you stand up and you talk about yourself. And you have to say I all the time. You can't say you. You have people talk. Normally, we weren't allowed to talk that way. We had to talk a certain way. It's been a while. It's hard to remember exactly everything we had to say about ourselves, but mainly we had to feel ashamed. I feel guilty because I took my parents' beer bottle out of the cupboard and I drank it, and I'm so ashamed of myself. And then somebody would get called on and relate, like they agree, that you should feel ashamed of yourself and this and that. But
well, here's some of the things and I think it was you that wrote on the blog. You wrote that we had to live with permanent negative side effects, no sunlight, little sleep, total vocabulary manipulation, constant humiliation, instilling a fear of death or insanity for not finishing the program. Did they say you would die if you didn't finish the program?
Well, pretty much. It's like a motto of the program is dead, insane, or in jail. My personal case was I was 20 when I went in, so legally speaking, it was voluntary.
Voluntary, yeah.
And my parents had been convinced before I was, of course. The preacher at the local church that they were members of had recommended that I go there. So I went in there, and they told me, well, if you don't finish this program, you're not going to be part of the family. Because they had bought the program hook, line, and sinker.
William, you write on the blog, manifestations of self-doubt, hypercritical observations, personality extortion, parent manipulation, suicide attempts, and then you write exacerbated drug use via self-medication, physical trauma, forced abortions, attempted murder, hetero and homosexual rape, all of that?
Well, that sums it all up. It doesn't give exact specific examples because some of these people probably don't want their names out there or whatever, but it pretty much sums it up.
Well, hang on. We have a lot more to go. I'm afraid we have to take another break. William, you stay on the line. We have an entire hour more to investigate Straight Inc. and why its leader became ambassador under George W. Bush. Stay tuned for the next hour.